When I was in Post Falls last month with our missions team, we had the opportunity to go to church on Sunday morning at the church that we were serving. And it was while I was there that my friend, Pastor Jeff Smith, said a question in his sermon. It wasn't really planned. Matter of fact, he didn't even remember saying the question when I talked to him later about it. But I haven't been able to forget that question. It's kind of gripped me, and I haven't forgot it. And this is the question that he asked. He said, do you have, even if God doesn't, faith? Now, let me explain where this question came from. It's found in the context of what he was preaching on that morning, which was Daniel chapter 3. In Daniel chapter 3 is the story of the three Hebrew men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were confronted by Nebuchadnezzar. They'd been taken as slaves, and now they were told that they had to bow down and worship this golden image. And if they didn't, they'd be thrown into a fiery furnace. And so I want to read from you the text here, starting in chapter 3, starting at verse 16. And it says this: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, there it is. Even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods and worship the golden statue that you set up. That's steadfast faith. That's a faith that's steadfast and determined. Paul talked about this type of faith in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 58, when he said, therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, be steadfast, immovable, always excelling in the Lord's work, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. See, steadfast faith is firm. It's fixed. It's immovable. It's not going to be moved. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are some of the clearest examples of steadfast faith in the Bible. They were pressured to deny God, but they chose to be faithful no matter what happened. They were pressured to deny God, but they said, no, it doesn't matter what the outcome, we're going to serve our God regardless. Now think of this. Here's another question for you to ponder for a moment. If God always rescues us from hardship, is faith even necessary? We follow Jesus by faith. It's a life of faith. We're told we walk by faith and not by sight. Steadfast faith in God is determined to say, I'm going to follow no matter what the outcome is. No matter if God intervenes on my behalf or not, I'm going to be faithful to him. That's even if he doesn't, faith. That's what I'm talking about tonight. Even if he doesn't. Think of it. Even if he doesn't heal my spouse, I'm going to continue to serve God and have faith. Even if he doesn't provide my need, I'm going to be faithful. Even if he doesn't defend my reputation, my faith is going to stay true. Do you have that kind of faith? It's a faith that completely trusts and clings and relies upon God in every circumstance all the time. To help us understand what steadfast faith looks like and how we explain a little bit more, let me tell you, by contrasting it with two things steadfast faith is not. Steadfast faith is not presumptive. It's not presumptive. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were men of faith, but they were not men of presumption. If they had declared that God was going to deliver them, that would have been presumption. They truly didn't know God's complete plan in the situation. Instead, they shared that God was able to save them. But even if he doesn't, they still would not bow down to the king's golden image. See, steadfast faith confesses the Lord and obeys him regardless of the situation. Now, I remember a time in my life where I switched jobs. From one job, I left one job to a job that was an outside salesman position that was full commission. Now, prior to that, I had worked at a job for 3 years where I had a steady paycheck. It was a good job. It had benefits. It paid me well. And God was directing me to take this other job that was all commission because it gave me an opportunity to pursue ministry in a better way. And so God told me to trust him. But I was able to find a loophole. How many can understand what I'm talking about here? I was able to find a loophole in having to trust him completely, or at least I thought. See, my new boss came to me and he said, you know, Brian, I can do this for you. I can give you a base salary until you start making enough money. And then what you can do is once you start making more money on your commissions than the base salary, you can pay me back. I thought, wow, there's that loophole. So I took that opportunity. And the first paycheck went by, and I got my first paycheck, and God convicted me. And he said, Brian, I told you to trust me. You're not trusting me. And I remember I went to my boss, and I said, you know, I can't do this anymore. I don't want that anymore. On my next pay period, please pay back everything that I owe, and I just want whatever I made. Well, you know what? God was faithful. And on my next pay period, I looked at my check and I realized that I had more than the base salary. And I actually went to my boss and questioned it. And he said, no, you paid me all back, and that's what's left. See, God was faithful. Now, Hebrews chapter 11 is the faith chapter in the Bible. It's where we see all the heroes of faith. And the names of men and women who were faithful to God. Now, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's names do not appear there, but they're there. And let me read to you and show you where they're at. Hebrews 11, 33 through 35 reads like this. By faith, these people overthrew kingdoms, ruled with justice, and received what God had promised them. They shut down mouths of lions, quenched flames of fire. There they are. They're right there. Quenched flames of fire and escaped death by the edge of the sword. Their weakness was turned to strength. They became strong in battle and put whole armies to flight. Women received their loved ones back again from death. Now, later in verse 35, all the way to verse 40, the list goes on of people who failed in spite of their faith, or at least it would appear that they failed in spite of their faith. And let me read just the rest of this chapter, or the rest of this portion. But others were tortured, refusing to turn from God in order to be set free. They placed their hope in a better life after the resurrection. Some were jeered at, and their backs were cut open with whips. Others were chained in prisons. Some died by stoning. Some were sawed in half, and others were killed by the sword. Some went about wearing skins of sheep and goats, destitute and oppressed and mistreated. They were too good for this world, wandering over the deserts and the mountains, hiding in caves and in holes and in the ground. All these people earned a good reputation because of their faith. Yet none of them received all that God had promised. For God had something better in mind for us, so that they would not reach perfection without us. See, God always rewards faith. He always rewards it, but he doesn't always step in and perform a miracle. And that's what I want you to hear. He doesn't always do that. Not every prayer for healing is answered. We know that. But God always gives us enough strength and grace to endure. These three men believed that God could save them, but they were determined to trust him even if he did not. That's steadfast faith. That's how it operates. Here's the second thing I want you to see, that steadfast faith is not conditional. It's not conditional. See, the prayer of Habakkuk demonstrates this point. Habakkuk prayed a prayer in Habakkuk chapter 3, and I want to read to you verses 17 and 18. When he said this, he said, even though the fig trees have no blossoms, and there's no grapes on the vines, even though the olive crops fail, and the fields lie empty and barren, even though the flocks die in the fields, and the cattle barns are empty, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in my God of my salvation. Amen. Even though. See, steadfast faith is an even though faith. It's a faith that's unconditional. It's not based on my circumstances. It's not based on my even though. It's based on my God. It doesn't sway by the circumstances that are around me. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had that kind of faith. It was not conditional. They knew that God could rescue them. They had no doubts about that. But they were determined to stay committed to God, whether he rescued them or not. Obeying God was more important to them than life itself. Having faith does not mean we're always spared from all our problems and our hardships. If you don't believe me, just ask Moses, if you could, or ask Joshua, Peter, or Paul. They would tell you, their lives tell you, that it takes more faith to stick with God through difficult, dark situations than it does to see him rescue you in every situation. In a world that's constantly pressuring us to deny our faith and compromise our commitment to Christ, we must have an unconditional, steadfast faith. So here are three things that steadfast faith says and does. Three things that it says and does. The first one is it trusts. It trusts. Let's go back to the words of those three men. In verse 17, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power. In this statement, the three showed complete trust in God's saving power. They had no doubt that God could save them from the fire, that he could save them from Nebuchadnezzar himself. Their faith completely trusted in God's saving power. The second thing is it clings. Look at verse 18 again. But even if he doesn't, there's that question, there's that statement, even if he doesn't. See, in this statement, these three show that they fully clinged to the sovereignty of God. That God was sovereign and he would have his will be done. They believed that God had the power to save them, but they also knew that even if he didn't, they weren't going to deny him. Their hope was not determined based on what he did or didn't do. Their hope was in him alone. And they didn't doubt God's ability, but neither did they presume to know God's will in everything. They recognized that God's plan might be different than what they expected or what they desired. Their faith was fully clinging to God. And here's the last one. It relies upon. Let's finish verse 18. We want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the golden statue that you set up. In that statement, these three men showed that they totally relied upon God for the outcome. They didn't know what the outcome was, but they were going to rely on him anyways. God brought them to a place of steadfast faith by preparing them with smaller tests. Now think about this. They were able to stand up under this great test because they'd gone through some tests before. Remember, earlier in the book, they were tested about if they would eat the impure food or not. And because they walked with God and trusted him through that, and he was faithful, now they could stand in even greater circumstances, even when the stakes were higher now. David was no different. David, when he went to confront the giant, what gave him faith that he could kill the giant? He'd killed a lion and he killed a bear. God had helped him do that before, so he believed he passed those tests. God could help him defeat the giant as well. See, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego showed that obedience to God in small things really does matter. It matters. Matter of fact, Jesus said it this way: if you're faithful with the little things, you will be faithful with the large ones. So as the worship team comes back out, and begins to play, I just want to remind you something. Jesus taught us to pray with steadfast faith. He taught us to pray this way. Matter of fact, when the disciples came to him and said, teach us to pray, the model of prayer, he started out by saying this: Our Father in heaven, may your name be kept holy. May your kingdom come. May your will be done. He's teaching us to rely on him, to cling on him, to trust in him there. And Jesus demonstrated this same kind of faith in his prayer when he prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane the night he was betrayed. In Luke 22:42, Jesus said, Father, if you are willing, please take this cup of suffering from me. Yet I want your will to be done, not mine. Again, saying, I trust you. I cling on you. I rely upon you, God. Your sovereignty, your goodness, your will. God wants us to possess a steadfast faith that completely trusts, clings, and relies upon Jesus at all times. Now, on the screen, I'm going to have 3 questions. And what I want us to do for the next few moments is to reflect on these 3 questions. Where do you need to completely trust in God's saving power? Where do you need to completely trust in his saving power? Where do you need to fully cling to the sovereignty of God's will in your life? And where do you know you need to totally rely upon God for the outcome? Let's take a moment to reflect on that. And as we take a moment to reflect on, I want to ask you to do 2 things, or at least to consider to do 2 things. The first one, it might seem a little bit weird, but let me explain. I want you to speak to your circumstance and declare that even if God doesn't, you're going to remain faithful. That even if he doesn't, whatever the circumstance you're facing, speak to this. I don't care how it turns out, I'm going to remain faithful. And then the second thing I want you to do is, and encourage you to do, is ask Jesus to give you even though faith. Even though I don't know how it's going to turn out, I'm going to trust you. Even though there's very little left in my bank account, I'm going to trust you. I'm going to cling on you, cling to you. Even though I've been praying for this thing over and over and it hasn't been answered, I'm going to continue to rely upon you. A steadfast faith that fully trusts, clings, and relies upon Jesus in every circumstance.